The Duke of Blackwood believed the matter was quite simple. One did not, when entertaining a foreign diplomat upon whose goodwill a rather crucial trade agreement depended, offer an unvarnished opinion on the state of his country's colonial finances. One did not refer to a recent venture in the West Indies as an exercise in elegant incompetence. One certainly did not when the diplomat in question, Monsieur Dubois, inquired politely after one's new duchess. Expect said duchess to respond with a truth so stark and unadorned it felt like a slap. "I find my position," she had said, her voice as clear and placid as still water, "to be one of considerable responsibility and negligible influence. It is a mathematical curiosity." Alistair Finch, the fifth Duke of Blackwood, had felt the silence in the dining room coalesce into something solid, a block of ice pressing down on the damask tablecloth. He had watched Monsieur Dubois' eyebrows, two expressive gray apostrophes, lift slightly. It was the only sign of the man's surprise. Alistair had smiled a smile so tight it ached at the hinges of his jaw, a rictus of aristocratic control, and smoothly redirected the conversation toward the far safer topic of pheasant shooting. Later, in the cold marble expanse of the grand hallway, after the diplomat's carriage had rolled away into the damp London night, he had turned to his wife. Eleanor stood a few feet from him, a slender figure in pale gray silk, her hands clasped loosely before her. She was not beautiful, not in the way society prized. Her features were too definite, her gaze too direct. She was a woman one's eye might skim over in a crowded ballroom, unremarkable until she spoke. And then one wished she had remained silent. That, he said, the word clipped and hard, was a catastrophe. She met his gaze without flinching. "I was asked a question, Your Grace. I answered it. You are the Duchess of Blackwood now, Eleanor. You are not a Socratic philosopher in a ladies' debating society. Your role is to be charming, not analytical. He is a diplomat. He deals in pleasantries, in the careful architecture of lies that holds nations together. He does not require a clinical assessment of your marital satisfaction or a critique of French foreign policy." "I see," she said. And the terrible thing was, he knew that she did. Her perception was unnervingly acute. She saw everything, and that, he was beginning to realize, was the very core of the problem. He made a gesture of dismissal, a sharp, angry flick of his wrist. "You are simply too honest for diplomacy, for this world. Leave it to me. In the future, when we have guests of importance, you will confine your conversation to the weather and the quality of the stitchwork on the nearest cushion." He did not wait for a reply. He turned on his heel and strode toward his study, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He left her standing there, a solitary statue in a sea of polished marble. He did not look back. If he had, he might have seen the flicker of something in her eyes, not hurt, not anger, but a quiet, chilling appraisal. It was the look of a mathematician who has just been handed a faulty equation and has already calculated, with unerring precision, precisely where and how it will fail. Their marriage was itself a faulty equation. Alistair had entered into it with the cold logic of an investor. The Vance family had an impeccable lineage and, more importantly, a considerable fortune derived from shipping that was needed to revitalize the flagging agricultural estates of the Blackwood Duchy. Eleanor Vance was their only daughter. She was 26, past the first blush of youth, and considered by the ton to be something of a bluestocking, quiet, bookish, and unnervingly intelligent. She was, his advisors had assured him, manageable. She had no airs, no demanding social ambitions. She would be a placid and appropriate fixture, a duchess to produce an heir and run his houses with quiet efficiency. He had mistaken her quietness for docility. It was a profound error in calculation. He had spent a single, stilted half-hour in her father's drawing room before the engagement was announced. He had noted her plain brown hair, her steady gray eyes, and her refusal to engage in the flirtatious badinage that was the currency of their class. He had categorized her as sensible and uncomplicated, and had considered the matter settled. He had acquired a duchess, just as he had acquired a new pair of matched bays for his carriage. The function was the thing. Now, 2 months into their union, he found his asset was not performing to specification. She ran the household, it was true. The ledgers were balanced to the penny. The staff moved with a silent, well-oiled precision he had never seen under his mother's chaotic reign, and the menus were both economical and exquisite. He had to grant her that. Her competence was absolute, but competence was a private virtue. In public, where it mattered, she was a liability. She did not flatter. She did not dissemble. She listened with an unnerving intensity, and when she spoke, she deployed the truth like a weapon. He sat at his desk, the fire hissing in the grate, and penned a letter to Lord Rexall, the Foreign Secretary and his closest political ally. His frustration bled onto the page, the nib of his pen scratching angrily against the thick cream paper. The meeting with Dubois was less than successful, he wrote. I fear my new duchess, while a paragon of domestic management, possesses a sincerity so radical it borders on the belligerent. She has no concept of the delicate dance of diplomacy, and managed to insult the man's country and my marriage in the space of a single course. I shall have to engage in considerable repair work to salvage the situation. It is a damnable inconvenience. I married for peace and efficiency, and I find myself saddled with a Socratic gadfly in silk. He sanded the letter, folded it, and left it on the corner of his desk for his secretary to seal and dispatch in the morning. He felt a grim satisfaction. He had defined the problem. He had named it. Now he simply had to manage it, to contain his wife's unfortunate honesty until she learned to curb it herself. It did not occur to him that some things, once named, refused to be contained. It did not occur to him that he had just signed not a letter, but a warrant for the polite, orderly, and transactional peace of his own life. He had made his assessment, rendered his judgment, and moved on. He had failed to see, and in his world, in the world he commanded, what the Duke of Blackwood failed to see effectively ceased to exist. For a time, his assessment seemed correct. Life at Blackwood House settled into a new, even colder, rhythm. Eleanor was a ghost in her own home. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. At breakfast, she would be seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, a book propped against the silver toast rack, her attention entirely consumed by its pages. She would murmur a polite, "Good morning, Your Grace," without looking up, her voice a neutral, distant sound. Alistair found it a relief. The silence was preferable to her unsettling pronouncements. He had, he thought, successfully communicated the terms of her role. She was to be a decorative and silent administrator. He had his estates, his politics, his club, and his mistress. A far more suitable arrangement, as the lady in question knew the value of a well-placed and entirely insincere compliment. He did not notice, at first, the flaw in his logic. He did not notice that the quiet efficiency of the household was not an innate property of the house itself, but the direct result of a keen and observant intelligence that was now being deliberately withheld from him. He was forced into a brief recalibration one Tuesday morning. He was in his study, wrestling with a particularly intractable dispute between two tenant farmers on his northernmost estate, a quarrel over water rights that had festered for a generation. His estate manager had sent a thick packet of documents, a confusing mess of conflicting claims, ancient deeds, and angry letters. Alistair, whose mind was excellent with broad political strokes, but impatient with granular detail, had a headache. The door opened softly. It was Eleanor. She held a small vase of snowdrops. "I did not mean to disturb you," she said. "The housekeeper mentioned you were working on the Fenley matter." "I am," he said shortly, rubbing his temples, and failing to make any sense of it. She hesitated at the door, then stepped inside. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the chaos of papers on his desk. Annoyed, but also, if he were honest, desperate, he waved a hand in assent. He expected her to offer some useless, feminine suggestion about appealing to their better natures. Instead, she stood beside his desk, her gaze sweeping over the documents. She did not touch them. She simply looked, her head tilted slightly, her gray eyes narrowed in concentration. For 5 minutes, she was utterly still. Alistair watched her, a flicker of irritation mixing with a strange, unwilling curiosity. She was so self-contained, so methodical. Finally, she spoke. "The issue is not the 1789 deed of transfer," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "Both men are misinterpreting it. The deed grants access to the stream, not ownership of the tributary that feeds it. The tributary's rights are governed by the older parish enclosure map of 1720. Mr. Hobbs has a copy in the records office. If you look at that map, you will see the watercourse was diverted 30 years before the deed was ever written. Miller's claim is therefore based on a false premise. Hemlock has the prior right." Alistair stared at her. He then stared at the papers, a jumble of legal jargon he had been trying to decipher for 2 hours. He had completely missed the significance of the enclosure map, mentioned only in a passing footnote in one of the letters. "How did you know that?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. A small, almost imperceptible shrug. "My father's business involved a great many contracts and disputes over shipping rights. One learns to identify the foundational document. Everything else is merely commentary." She placed the vase of snowdrops on a side table. "They are the first of the year," she said, and then she was gone, leaving behind the clean, cold scent of winter earth and a silence that felt suddenly, profoundly, less comfortable. He sent for the 1720 map. She was, of course, correct. The solution was as elegant and obvious as she had made it sound. He felt a stab of something he refused to name. It felt unnervingly like being assessed and found wanting. He dismissed the feeling. It was a fluke. Her mercantile background had coincidentally prepared her for this specific, trivial problem. It meant nothing. He resolved the dispute with a single letter, impressing his estate manager with his incisive grasp of the situation. He did not mention his wife. The incident was an anomaly, a brief crack in the smooth, predictable surface of their arrangement. He papered it over and forgot it. He continued to see her as he had chosen to see her, a quiet, plain woman who was good with accounts and bad at dinner parties, a domestic necessity. He saw the gray silk dresses, the neatly coiled brown hair, the book held as a shield. He did not see the mind behind the quiet eyes, a mind that was constantly observing, analyzing, and calculating. A mind that was, he would later realize, watching him. The discovery happened on a Thursday. It was a day of relentless, weeping rain, the sky a uniform shade of slate. Alistair had been at his club all afternoon, and he returned to find the house unnaturally quiet. He went to his study, intending to work for an hour before dressing for dinner. The room was cold. The fire had not been lit. An oversight. He made a mental note to reprimand the footman. His desk was, as always, immaculate. His secretary, Mr. Hobbs, was a man of preternatural organization. Papers were stacked in neat, weighted piles. Pens were aligned. The only thing out of place was the letter he had written to Lord Wrexhall nearly a fortnight ago. He had assumed it long gone. But there it was, sitting not on the corner where he had left it for dispatch, but in the precise center of his leather blotter. He frowned. Had Hobbs forgotten it? Impossible. The man never forgot anything. Alistair picked it up. It was still folded, but the creases were different. They were sharper, more exact, as if it had been opened, read, and then refolded with immense care. He knew, with a sudden, sickening lurch in his gut, whose hands were capable of such precision. He opened the letter. The words he had written in a fit of pique seemed to leap off the page, stark and brutal in the gray afternoon light. A sincerity so radical it borders on the belligerent, a damnable inconvenience, a Socratic gadfly in silk. He remembered then. Hobbs had been called away to his sister's sickbed for a week. The day after Alistair had written the letter, Eleanor had mentioned that she was assisting with some of his correspondence to ensure nothing was overlooked. He had barely listened, nodding his assent while reading a report from Parliament. He had assumed she meant social invitations, household matters. She had seen it. She had read it. She had understood exactly what he thought of her, what he had written of her to his friend. And she had said nothing, nothing at all. There had been no tears, no recriminations, no dramatic confrontation. There had been only a quiet closing of a door he had not even known was open. The chill he felt now had nothing to do with the unlit fire. It was the dawning, horrifying understanding of the nature of her silence. It was not submission. It was a verdict. He stood there, the letter in his hand, and for the first time he began to see. He saw not a plain, difficult woman, but a person of immense, disciplined pride. A pride he had trampled with the careless arrogance of a man who believes he has the right to define the world for everyone in it. He thought of the past 2 weeks, her retreat into books, her monosyllabic answers. He had seen it as her reluctant acquiescence to his command. He saw now that it was a strategic withdrawal. She had not been cowed. She had been observing the terms of his assessment of her and choosing, with deliberate, quiet agency, to live within them. He had called her an inconvenience, and so she had set about becoming as insubstantial as a ghost, removing the inconvenience of her intellect, her opinions, her very presence from his life. He sank into his chair, the letter falling from his fingers. The house was not merely quiet. It was empty, and he was beginning to understand that he was the one who had emptied it. The unraveling was a subtle affair. It was an erosion, not an earthquake. It was the quiet accumulation of absences. Alistair, a man who had lived his life on a grand scale, dealing in treaties and territories, was forced to confront the profound significance of the infinitesimal. He began to notice things. He noticed the flowers. Previously, the arrangements in the grand hall had been artful and surprising. Wild orchids one week, a stark arrangement of white roses the next. Now they were merely present. Large, generic bouquets of whatever was available from the hothouse, placed in the center of tables with geometric but soulless precision. They were arrangements made by a housekeeper following an order, not by a hand with a point of view. He noticed the food. The menus, once inventive and perfectly balanced, became predictable. Roast beef on Sunday, salmon on Tuesday. It was all impeccably cooked, but the flair, the unexpected spice, the thoughtful pairing of flavors, it was gone. The meals were fuel, no longer a pleasure. He found himself eating without tasting, the silence at the long table stretching between him and his wife, a dead space punctuated only by the clink of silver on porcelain. He noticed the library. He had always considered it her domain, a dusty, quiet place he rarely entered. One evening, searching for a map, he stepped inside. The room felt different. The faint scent of lemon oil and old paper was gone, replaced by a stale, unused air. A fine layer of dust coated the reading table. The books she was always reading were gone from it. The room was no longer a sanctuary. It was an archive. It was a space that was no longer lived in. She was there, and she was not. She performed her duties as Duchess with a chilling perfection. She oversaw the staff, approved the menus, and managed the accounts. She attended social functions with him, a serene and silent figure at his side. She spoke when spoken to, her answers brief and polite. She had mastered the art of being entirely present in body and utterly absent in spirit. She had become exactly what he had demanded. A charming automaton, her conversation limited to the weather and the quality of the stitch work. And it was maddening. He found himself trying to provoke a reaction. He would make a deliberately controversial statement about politics at dinner, hoping to draw her into a debate. She would simply nod and say, "Indeed, Your Grace," her eyes fixed on her plate. He would ask for her opinion on an estate matter, a direct reference to the time she had so effortlessly solved the Fenley dispute. She would reply, "I am sure your own judgment is sufficient, Your Grace." She was a mirror, reflecting back at him the empty space he had created. He had wanted a duchess who was not a Socratic gadfly, and now he had one. He was discovering, to his slowly dawning horror, that the gadfly's sting was infinitely preferable to this void. The silence in the house became a presence in itself. It was the silence of a watch that has stopped ticking. All the components were still there, perfectly formed and in their correct places. But the animating force, the thing that made it work, was gone. He had not realized that the animating force of his home, the quiet intelligence that made it run with such seamless grace, was her. The catalyst for his full realization came, as irony would have it, in the form of a letter from Monsieur Dubois. It arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the seal of the French embassy a stark red against the white envelope. Alistair broke it with a sense of foreboding. He expected a polite but firm rejection of his latest trade proposals, a consequence of the disastrous dinner party. He read the letter once, then twice. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis. Monsieur Dubois extended his compliments to the Duke. He thanked him for his recent hospitality, and then he made a most unusual request. He wished to have a second, more informal meeting to discuss the trade agreement. He believed they had, at their first meeting, become mired in unnecessary formality. He wished to cut through the diplomatic pleasantries and have a frank discussion. And for this frank discussion, he had a condition. He requested a preliminary conversation to frame the main points, and he requested that this conversation be with Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood. alone. Alistair stared at the words, with her grace, alone. It made no sense. It was a breach of all protocol. A diplomat did not negotiate with the wife of his counterpart, especially not a wife who had insulted his country's colonial policy. It was absurd. It was impossible. He summoned his secretary, Mr. Hobbs, who had returned from his family emergency looking older and sadder, but with his usual air of quiet competence restored. "Hobbs," Alistair said, handing him the letter. "Read this. Tell me what it means." The secretary read the letter, his face impassive. He was a man who had served the Blackwood Dukes for 40 years, a quiet repository of all their secrets and follies. "It seems quite clear, Your Grace," Hobbs said, his voice neutral. "Monsieur Dubois wishes to speak with the Duchess." "But why?" Alistair exploded, the question that had been pounding in his head. She was a disaster. She offended him. She is, as I believe I stated at the time, too honest for diplomacy. Hobbs met his master's gaze. For the first time in their long association, Alistair saw a flicker of something other than deference in the old man's eyes. It might have been pity. "Perhaps, Your Grace," Hobbs said softly, "you have mistaken the nature of the game. You assume that diplomacy is always about flattery. There are some men, experienced men like Monsieur Dubois, who have grown weary of it. They have heard every compliment, every veiled promise. It is all just noise to them." He paused, choosing his next words with care. Perhaps such a man might find a moment of unvarnished truth to be refreshing, like a glass of cold water in a desert of sweet wine. Perhaps he concluded that the Duchess, in her honesty, was the one person in the room with whom a truly productive conversation could be had. The secretary's words fell into the silence of the room, and in that silence, everything connected. The solved tenant dispute, the inventive menus, the artful flowers, the quiet, unnerving intelligence he had dismissed as an inconvenience. Dubois had not seen an insult. He had seen a first-rate mind. He had recognized in a single dinner what Alistair had failed to see in 2 months of marriage. He had seen her value. The epiphany was a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. He was the fool. He was the one who was blind, deaf, and stupid. He, the Duke of Blackwood, the master of his world, had been operating on a set of assumptions so profoundly, embarrassingly wrong that a foreign diplomat had seen through them in an evening. He thought of the letter. His letter. The one that called her a gadfly and an inconvenience. He saw it again, lying on his desk, refolded with that terrible precision. It was not an accusation. It was a tombstone. It was the marker for the moment she had given up trying to be seen by him. He looked at Hobbs. "She saw the letter I wrote to Rexall," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace," Hobbs said quietly. "She was helping with the dispatch box. I believe she thought it was part of the official business." There was a subtle emphasis on the word believe that told Alistair everything he needed to know. Hobbs had left the letter there deliberately. The wise, loyal servant had seen the sickness in the house and had administered a desperate, painful cure. "Thank you, Hobbs," Alistair said, his voice rough. "That will be all." When the secretary had gone, Alistair walked to the window and looked out at the rain-swept London square. He saw his own reflection in the glass, a faint, ghostly image of a man he no longer recognized. He had built his life on the foundations of perception, of seeing the political landscape, of perceiving weakness in his opponents, of understanding the levers of power. and he had failed the most fundamental test of perception of all. He had failed to see the person sleeping in the room next to his own. He had to find her. He had to speak to her, not to apologize. The word felt laughably inadequate, but to confess his own profound and catastrophic blindness. He turned from the window and walked out of his study, his footsteps quick and certain. For the first time, he was not going to manage a problem. He was going to try, with no certainty of success, to understand it. He sought her in the places he had assigned to her in his mind: the morning room, the sewing room, her private sitting room. All were empty, tidy, and soulless. It was as if she could vanish from a room, leaving no trace that she had ever been there. Finally, a footman informed him that the Duchess was in the main library. The library. The room he had noted was now dusty and abandoned. He pushed open the heavy oak doors. The room was not empty. She was there, at the far end, perched on a rolling ladder, a leather-bound book in her hand. She was not reading it. She was examining the spine, her fingers tracing the faded gold leaf. She was wearing a simple, dark blue day dress, and the pale light from the high arched windows caught the stray wisps of hair that had escaped her neat coil. She did not seem to hear him enter. The vast room absorbed the sound. He walked slowly down the long aisle between the towering shelves, the scent of old leather and paper finally returning to his senses. He felt like an intruder in his own house. This was her space, and he had neglected it, just as he had neglected her. He stopped a few feet from the ladder. "Eleanor," he said. She started, a barely perceptible motion. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. There was no surprise, no fear, no anger. It was the calm, detached gaze of a naturalist observing a specimen. "Your Grace," she said, her voice even. She did not move from her perch. He felt a raw, unfamiliar helplessness. He had commanded men in Parliament, negotiated with ambassadors, managed the fortunes of a duchy, but he had no idea how to speak to his own wife. The old words, the words of command and polite dismissal, were useless to him now. They were the tools of a fool. "I received a letter from Monsieur Dubois," he began, his voice sounding hollow in the high-ceilinged room. "Oh," she said, a single, non-committal syllable. She turned her attention back to the book in her hands. "He wishes to reopen negotiations. He has requested a preliminary meeting with you." He watched her face for a reaction, for some sign of vindication or triumph. There was nothing. She remained perfectly still. "I see," she said at last, her gaze still on the book. "That is unexpected." "Is it?" he asked, and the question was raw with self-recrimination. Hobbes suggested it was entirely predictable, to anyone with eyes to see. He took a step closer. "I have been a fool, Eleanor, a blind, arrogant fool." The words came out harder than he expected, torn from a place of deep, newly discovered shame. She finally lowered the book and looked at him. Her gray eyes were clear and direct. "You have been a duke, Alistair. You have behaved precisely as a man of your station is taught to behave. You assessed an asset, found it wanting in a particular application, and made a note to adjust its function. It was a matter of business." Her calm, analytical dismantling of his actions was more damning than any tirade. She was not accusing him. She was merely stating the facts as she saw them. She had been a business transaction, and he had been a dissatisfied client. "It was not business," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It was our life. It is our life, and I have broken it." "One cannot break what was never whole," she replied, her voice still quiet, still devastatingly precise. It was an arrangement, a contract. I have endeavored to fulfill my side of it. By disappearing? He challenged, a flicker of his old frustration rising. By becoming a ghost in my house? I gave you what you asked for, she said, and for the first time, a sliver of emotion entered her voice, a fine edge of steel. You asked for a duchess who would not inconvenience you with her thoughts. You wrote that I was an inconvenience, a gadfly. I took you at your word. I removed the inconvenience. I am surprised you even noticed. That was the blow that landed. I am surprised you even noticed. It laid his negligence bare. He hadn't, not for weeks. He had blundered on in his comfortable darkness until the silence became too loud to ignore. I noticed, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Everything is wrong. The flowers, the food, the silence. This house has no center, not since you withdrew from it. He took another step until he was standing at the base of the ladder, looking up at her. I was wrong, he said, the words costing him more than any concession he had ever made in his life. I was wrong about Dubois. I was wrong about diplomacy. I was wrong about you. I did not see you, Eleanor. I looked, but I did not see. This was the heart of it, the confession, not of a mistake, but of a fundamental failure of perception. He was admitting his own blindness. She watched him for a long, silent moment. He could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest. He had no idea what she was thinking, what she would do. She held all the power in this quiet, dusty room. She could have destroyed him with a single, cutting word. Instead, she slowly descended the ladder, her movements graceful and deliberate. When she reached the floor, she stood before him, not close, but no longer separated by height. "And what do you see now?" she asked. The question was not a challenge. It was a genuine inquiry. He looked at her, and for the first time, he let himself truly see. He saw past the plain dress and the simple hair. He saw the intelligence in her clear eyes. He saw the strength in the set of her jaw. He saw the pride in her posture. He saw a woman of substance and depth, a woman he had almost completely missed. "I see my Duchess," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I see the woman who solved the Fenley dispute in 5 minutes. I see the woman who terrified a French diplomat with her honesty and then earned his respect. I see the center of my house." He made no move to touch her. He simply stood there, offering his confession as the only thing he had. He had to prove it was real. Words were not enough. He needed an action. "Monsieur Dubois is expecting a reply," he said. "I am going to accept his invitation. I am going to tell him that you will meet with him as he requests, and that you will do so with my full authority and confidence. You will speak for House Blackwood. You will speak for me." He was handing her power, publicly and unequivocally. He was taking the very thing he had condemned her for, her mind, her honesty, and declaring it to be his greatest asset. It was a risk, a massive political and personal risk, but it was the only move he had left. It was the only way to show her that he had finally, truly begun to see. Eleanor did not capitulate. Her acceptance of his proposal was as cool and measured as one of her father's business contracts. She agreed to meet with Monsieur Dubois. She agreed to represent the Duke's interests. She did not, however, agree to forgive him. Forgiveness was an emotional transaction, and their relationship, she seemed to imply with her continued reserve, was not yet ready for such currency. The new terms were never spoken aloud. They did not need to be. They were enacted in the spaces between them. The new primary term was respect. Not the facile respect of a husband for his wife's title, but the genuine respect of one intellect for another. She would no longer be invisible. He would be required to see her, to listen to her, to acknowledge her presence, not as a fixture, but as a force. The period of rebuilding began. It was a slow, awkward, and often silent process. Alistair found himself behaving like a suitor in his own house, courting the woman who was already his wife. He began to change his routines. Instead of taking breakfast alone with his papers, he waited for her. He would ask her not about the household, but about the book she was reading. At first, her answers were clipped, factual summaries, but he persisted. "That is a treatise on Roman aqueducts," he observed one morning, trying to sound casual. "It is," she confirmed. "A dry subject for a duchess, is it not?" The old Alistair would have said it with a hint of condescension. The new one said it with genuine curiosity. She looked up from her book, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "It is a study in infrastructure and the projection of power. The Romans understood that control of water was control of civilization. It is not so different from controlling trade routes. It is about logistics, not just stones and mortar." He was silent for a moment, processing that. "I had not thought of it that way," he admitted. It was becoming a common refrain for him. He started bringing his work to her, not the trivial household accounts he had once deemed her sphere, but the complex, thorny issues of his political life. He would lay out a proposed parliamentary bill on his desk after dinner and say, "I would be interested in your perspective on the third clause. It seems to me to have an unforeseen consequence for landholders in the north." She would read it, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her analyses were always brilliant. They were stripped of party rhetoric and personal bias. She saw the mechanics of a law, the way the gears would turn and what they would grind in the process. She pointed out flaws he had missed, highlighted opportunities he had overlooked. He stopped thinking of it as asking for her help. He began to understand it as a partnership. The day of her meeting with Monsieur Dubois arrived. Alistair was a wreck of nerves. He paced the antechamber of the French embassy, a place where he was usually the master of his own emotions. He had escorted her to the door of the meeting room and had been politely but firmly excluded. He was now in the humiliating position of waiting like an anxious father while his wife conducted the business of his nation. He trusted her intellect. He knew she was capable. But he did not trust the world to see her as he now did. He feared they would see the plain, quiet woman and dismiss her, just as he had done. He spent an hour tormenting himself with images of her failure, of the diplomatic incident that would ruin him. When the door finally opened, it was Monsieur Dubois who emerged first. He was smiling. It was not his thin, polite diplomat's smile. It was a genuine expression of warmth and admiration. "Your Grace," the Frenchman said, clasping Alistair's hand, "you are a man of hidden depths. All this time, you possessed the most formidable strategic mind in London, and you kept her hidden away like a state secret." Eleanor appeared behind him, her expression calm. "Your Duchess, she does not waste time on flattery," Dubois continued, his eyes twinkling. "She laid out the weaknesses in your position and the weaknesses in my own with the precision of a surgeon. She has proposed a framework for our agreement that is so logical, so mutually beneficial, and so utterly devoid of nonsense that to refuse it would be an act of national self-sabotage. We have achieved more in 1 hour than our two governments have in 6 months. He bowed to Eleanor. Madame, it has been an honor. On the carriage ride home, Alistair was silent for a long time. He watched his wife as she gazed out the window at the passing London streets. She had done it. She had succeeded where he had been on the verge of failure. The external conflict, the one that had precipitated their entire crisis, was resolved. And it was her victory. Section. He called you a state secret, Alistair said finally. He was right. I kept you hidden, even from myself. She turned to look at him. He simply listened, she said. It is a rare skill. It is one I am trying to learn, he said quietly. That evening, he did not go to his club. He did not retreat to his study. He went to the library. He found her there, replacing the book on Roman aqueducts on its shelf. He came and stood beside her. Teach me, he said. Teach you what, Your Grace? To see things as you do, to understand the logistics, to identify the foundational document. Teach me how to read the world. A small, slow smile touched her lips. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her in months, and it transformed her face, lighting it from within. Very well, she said. The first lesson is this. One must begin by admitting one does not have all the information. It was the beginning. It was the first stone in a new foundation, laid not on contracts and convenience, but on the hard, solid bedrock of mutual respect. He was finally learning her language. A year made a world of difference. It did not erase the past, but it recontextualized it, turning a painful memory into the necessary, foundational story of their marriage. The Duke of Blackwood, once a man who moved through his life with the serene confidence of someone for whom the world was a well-ordered reflection of his own will, had become a student. His wife was his teacher. The harmony of their new life was not a matter of grand, romantic gestures. It was a quiet, daily practice of attention. It was Alistair bringing her a cutting from a political journal, his finger pointing to a particular paragraph, with the simple question, what is the flaw in his reasoning? It was Eleanor leaving a book open on his desk, a passage marked that shed new light on a historical treaty he was studying. Their minds, which had once been a source of division, had become their primary point of connection. Society noticed the change. The Duchess of Blackwood was no longer a silent, gray figure at her husband's side. She began to speak, not often, but when she did, people listened. Her observations were so incisive, her wit so dry and unexpected, that she developed a reputation for being formidable. At a dinner party, when a pompous minister was pontificating about the moral failings of the poor, the Duchess was heard to murmur, "It is a miracle they find the time for moral failing. What with the effort required merely to survive the policies designed for their betterment." The remark, repeated all over London, did more to damage the minister's bill than a week of parliamentary debate. Alistair, far from being chagrined, was immensely proud. He would watch her across a crowded room and feel a possessive thrill that was entirely new to him. It was not the pride of owning a beautiful object. It was the pride of being allied with a superior intellect. He had married her for her fortune. He had fallen in love with her for her mind. The symbolic fruition of their union was not a child, not yet. It was the west wing of Blackwood House. The wing had been left to crumble for decades, a place of damp, peeling wallpaper and forgotten furniture. Eleanor had taken an interest in it. She had spent months in the estate archives, studying the original architectural plans. "The structure is sound," she told Alistair one evening, showing him the 17th century blueprints. The problem is not decay, but a series of foolish, cosmetic alterations made by your great-grandfather. He blocked the light. He rerouted the airflow. He tried to make it fashionable, and in doing so, he made it uninhabitable. The foundation is strong. It simply needs to be uncovered. The parallel was so obvious, so poignant, that neither of them had to voice it. He gave her a limitless budget. Under her meticulous direction, the wing was restored. Walls were torn down, windows were unbricked, and light and air were allowed to flood the long dormant spaces. When it was finished, it was the most beautiful part of the house, a perfect marriage of historical integrity and modern comfort. They moved their own private apartments there, into a space they had, together, brought back to life. One cool autumn evening, 2 years after the disastrous dinner with Monsieur Dubois, they were in the restored library of the West Wing. A fire crackled in the hearth. Eleanor was curled in an armchair, reading, and Alistair was on the floor at her feet, leaning against the chair, ostensibly reading his own papers, but mostly just content to be in her presence. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a shared space, comfortable and full. He reached up and took her free hand. She lowered her book, her fingers lacing with his. "Do you remember what you said to Monsieur Dubois that first night?" he asked quietly. "I said several things," she replied, a hint of her dry wit in her voice. "You would have to be more specific. You said your position was one of considerable responsibility and negligible influence." He paused. "I hope you do not still find that to be the case." She looked down at him, her expression soft in the firelight. "My responsibilities have indeed increased," she said. "I find I must now manage not only a household, but the Duke's political conscience as well. It is a considerable burden." He smiled, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "And your influence?" "My influence," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is precisely what it should be. It is the influence of a partner, freely sought and freely given." She leaned down, her lips brushing his forehead. "The equation is balanced now, Alistair." He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a profound sense of gratitude. He had come so close to missing it all. So close to living out his life in a cold, well-ordered house with a ghost for a wife. He had been saved not by his own wisdom, but by the integrity of the woman he had so carelessly underestimated, and by the perception of a stranger who had seen her clearly when he could not. He had learned, finally, that the most important foundation was not in a deed or a contract, but in the simple, revolutionary act of truly seeing the person right in front of you. He had learned that love was not an acquisition, but a form of attention, and he planned to spend the rest of his life paying it.